There was an image of Celeste's torso and her head in the trunk of the car, and the prosecutor had to ask what it was because you could not tell it was a head. It was absolutely, it was deplorable.
He apologized first, not for the argument, not for the fight that came later, the one that would end with her getting into a car. He called for her. This was earlier, quieter, a text message sent in January of 2024 that prosecutors say came from David Burke's own phone to a 13-year-old girl. For more than a year, that phone sat in evidence, its contents known only to investigators. This week, in a Los Angeles courtroom, that changed. A detective stood up, opened a folder, and began reading Burke's own words back to him in front of the judge who will decide if he stands trial for her murder. This is what was in them. This case has already had a car, a garage, and a set of chilling purchases at its center. This week, the story didn't move to a new location. It moved to the one place investigators say Burke never expected anyone else to see: the conversation history he kept with the girl he's accused of killing to keep quiet. Some of what follows involves the sexual abuse of a child. We're presenting it because it's now part of the public record in an active case, and because every person named here is legally presumed innocent unless proven guilty in court. Friday marked the fourth day of David Burke's preliminary hearing. Burke, known to millions as the singer D4vd, sat beside his attorney, Marilyn Bednarski, as he has for most of this week, while prosecutors worked through the evidence they say ties him to the killing of Celeste Rivas Hernandez. A preliminary hearing isn't a trial. There's no jury, no verdict at the end of it, and no requirement that the defense prove anything at all. A single judge listens to what the prosecution has and decides one narrow question: is there enough here to send this case forward to trial? It's a lower bar than a conviction, but it's still the moment where evidence gathered over more than a year, much of it never made public before this week, finally gets tested out loud in a room in front of the person it's about. That judge has already heard from a criminalist who matched bloodstains in Burke's garage to Celeste, heard from an officer who described what was left of her when she was found. On Friday, the witness was LAPD Detective Corey Farrell, and what he carried into that courtroom wasn't physical evidence in the traditional sense. It was language. Thousands of text messages pulled from an iCloud account and an iPhone seized from Burke's home, laid out in chronological order, like a second timeline running underneath the one everyone already knew. Farrell testified that the messages traced back further than most people following this case realized. Prosecutors allege the two met online in 2022 when Celeste was 11 years old. They allege the relationship turned sexual a few months after her 13th birthday in November of 2023. Burke was 18. None of that is new context for this video. What's new is what Burke allegedly wrote to her, and when. Farrell wasn't the first witness this week, and it's worth knowing what came before him, because the texts don't stand alone. They sit on top of physical evidence prosecutors had already spent 3 days laying out. A criminalist testified that bloodstains recovered from Burke's garage pulled off a rubber floor mat, a rowing machine, and a charger for his Tesla were a strong DNA match to Celeste. An officer who was among the first to see her remains after they were found described what he saw in terms blunt enough that even seasoned reporters in the room called it hard to sit through. By the time Farrell stood up with his folder of messages, the physical case was already largely on the table. The texts were something else. Not where she died, but why, in prosecutors' telling, it happened at all. There's also the matter of what Burke told police the first time anyone asked him about Celeste. In 2025, when investigators first questioned him, he said he barely knew her, that they'd met once, that whatever she may have told people about him wasn't accurate. Prosecutors have not been shy about pointing out how badly that account sits next to what his own phone would later show. The exchange prosecutors highlighted first is dated early January 2024. In it, Burke allegedly tells Celeste he's sorry, again, for putting her through something. She writes back that it's okay, that neither of them is in a position to raise a child, that it's for the best. He asks when she's going to get it done. She tells him it's scheduled. He asks, later in the same conversation, if it's his. She answers that, of course it is. Investigators say the messages continued for weeks after that, tracking what prosecutors describe as an abortion. Celeste underwent at 13 years old, arranged and discussed almost entirely between the two of them. In a later exchange, months on, Celeste allegedly wrote that she regretted it, that she felt like she'd taken a life. Detective Farrell also read a message investigators say captures something else entirely, not the pregnancy, but the shape of the relationship around it. In it, Celeste allegedly writes that all they ever do is have sex, and that she wants more than that for herself. She was 13 when she wrote that. What makes this batch of messages different from ordinary teenage text history isn't just the subject matter, it's the volume. Farrell testified to what he described as dozens of separate messages and images touching on contraception, on the pregnancy itself, and on the abortion, spread out across weeks rather than a single conversation. Prosecutors have framed it as a pattern, not an isolated lapse. A relationship where a discussion like this one was simply part of the ongoing texture of how Burke, then in his late teens, and Celeste, 13, communicated with each other. If you followed this case last fall, you may remember a report that Celeste's death certificate listed her as not pregnant in the year before she died. That detail is accurate, and it doesn't conflict with anything prosecutors presented this week. The pregnancy discussed in these texts was in January of 2024, more than a year before Celeste was killed. Two separate facts from two separate points in time, both true at once. It's a small thing to clarify, but in a case built almost entirely out of dates and timelines, getting the order right matters. The messages weren't the only thing investigators pulled from Burke's devices. Detective Farrell testified that his phone also contained a significant quantity of images and video that investigators characterized in his testimony as child sexual abuse material. Prosecutors said some of it involved Celeste. None of it was shown in open court. None of it will be described here beyond what's necessary to understand the charge against him: continuous sexual abuse of a child under the age of 14. This is the count, alongside murder and the unlawful mutilation of Celeste's remains, that Burke has pleaded not guilty to. Investigators have not said, publicly, when this material was created, or how long it sat on Burke's phone before it was found. What testimony has established is simpler, and in some ways worse. It wasn't a single lapse. It was part of a pattern, investigators say, ran alongside the pregnancy, the abortion, and the relationship as a whole. Different pieces of the same allegation, all pointing toward a 13-year-old and an adult who, prosecutors say, treated the relationship as something to manage and conceal rather than something to end. For a long time, the public case against him lived mostly in the physical world: a car, a garage, a set of purchases prosecutors say he made under a fake name. Chainsaws, heavy-duty bags, a burn cage, an inflatable pool. This week, the case moved somewhere else, into his phone, into his own sentences. What Burke did in the days after Celeste's death has been part of the record for a while, but it's worth restating now that a motive has a face to it. Prosecutors allege that once Celeste was dead, Burke traveled through several states on a promotional tour tied to his music career. The same career, prosecutors argue, he killed to protect. His debut album, a project he'd reportedly been building toward for years, was scheduled to release just 2 days after prosecutors say he killed her. He kept that date. He came back to Los Angeles afterward, and that's when prosecutors allege the dismemberment happened, in the garage where the bloodstains would later be found. The car sat with what was left of her inside it for months, until a tow yard employee noticed a smell in September of last year. The messages that seem to matter most to prosecutors, though, aren't from January of 2024. They're from the last 2 days of Celeste's life. On April 22, 2025, according to a brief filed by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, Burke and Celeste got into an extended argument over text. The subject, prosecutors say, was jealousy, Celeste's, over other women in Burke's life. The brief states that Burke had led her to believe the two of them had a future together, and that when the conversation turned, she became extremely upset. At some point in that exchange, prosecutors allege, Celeste threatened to disclose damaging information about their relationship, to end his career, to destroy his life. Burke, in one of the messages read into the record, calls it boundary setting. Terrible boundary setting. She tells him it isn't even about that it's a lot more than that. That exchange has been described elsewhere as the end of a turbulent relationship, one between an artist known, at that point, for a song that had become an anthem inside a massively popular video game, and a teenager prosecutors describe as a runaway. That contrast between how the public knew Burke and what prosecutors say was happening in private is a large part of why this case drew the attention it did in the first place. It's also, prosecutors argue, the exact thing Celeste was threatening to expose. The brief doesn't leave much room to read the April 22nd argument as anything other than what it appears to be. A teenager, backed into a corner by a relationship an adult had built around promises of a future, reaching for the one piece of leverage she had left. Prosecutors say Burke understood exactly what that leverage was, and exactly what it would cost him if she used it. The next night, April 23, 2025, prosecutors say Burke arranged an Uber, not for himself, for Celeste. The ride was to bring her from wherever she was to his home in the Hollywood Hills. According to the brief, Burke knew by then that he had to silence her before she followed through on what she'd threatened the night before. Prosecutors allege that very soon after Celeste arrived at his house, Burke stabbed her multiple times and stood by while she bled out. District Attorney Nathan Hochman has been direct about the motive prosecutors intend to argue at trial. Burke's debut album was 2 days from release. A scandal, at that moment, could have ended the career he'd spent years building. Hochman has said publicly that Celeste was a child, under 14, when Burke allegedly began a sexual relationship with her, and that when she threatened to expose it, he allegedly murdered her, cut up her body, and placed it in bags in the front trunk of his own car. Said plainly by the county's top prosecutor in a press conference most of the world was watching. A teenager tried to protect herself with the truth, and, prosecutors allege, it got her killed. What happened to her body afterward, the garage, the pool, the car, has already been covered in earlier reporting on this case. What's different now is the why prosecutors say sits underneath it. Not a single moment of panic. A relationship stretching back to when Celeste was 11, a pregnancy at 13, an abortion arranged over text, and finally, when she tried to use the truth as leverage, an Uber called to bring her to the place where she died. None of this happened in a vacuum. Burke built a real career on real success, a breakout song, a devoted fan base, a debut album that industry press had been anticipating. That success is part of why prosecutors say the stakes felt so high to him in the days before Celeste died, and it's part of why this case has stayed in headlines longer than most. His management company's own former financial manager was called to testify this week, a sign of just how far prosecutors have reached to establish the pressure Burke was allegedly under to protect what he'd built. Whatever happens at trial, the career that prosecutors say he killed to protect has already been reshaped by the same case built around that motive. And it will keep being reshaped, hearing by hearing, for as long as this case continues. None of this has been tested by a jury. That's worth repeating because a preliminary hearing can feel, from the outside, like a trial in miniature. Witnesses, evidence, a defense pushing back. Burke's attorney, Marilyn Bednarski, has spent this week trying to find the gaps. She's questioned why certain items recovered from the house weren't tested more thoroughly, including whether more extensive DNA analysis was done on evidence found outside the Tesla. And she's leaned hard on the condition of Celeste's remains, arguing that decomposition makes it difficult for anyone, including the medical examiner, to say with certainty how or exactly when she died. At one point this week, Bednarski went further, suggesting the medical examiner couldn't even rule out that Celeste herself had been holding whatever caused her injuries. It's an argument prosecutors clearly reject, and one a jury, if this goes to trial, would eventually have to weigh against everything else laid out this week. The blood, the purchases, the timeline, and now the messages. But it's a reminder that a preliminary hearing exists specifically so the defense can push back, and Bednarski has said she intends to keep doing exactly that. The hearing isn't finished. Another session is expected in the days ahead, and only after it wraps will the judge rule on whether there's enough here to send David Burke to trial. Whatever that ruling is, it will not be the end of this case. It will be the beginning of the part where these same messages, the ones read aloud this week for the first time, get tested in front of a jury instead of a judge. Before any of this, before the phone, before the hearing, before her name became attached to a defendant's, Celeste Rivas Hernandez was 13 years old, writing to someone she trusted that she wanted more for herself than what she had. She was right to want that. It's one of the only things in this entire case that isn't in dispute. She'll turn up again in this story, in whatever comes out of this hearing, and eventually in a trial. But it's worth sitting, for a moment, with the version of her that existed before any of that. A teenager who said, in her own words, that she deserved better than the relationship she was in. She never got the chance to have it. Every piece of evidence presented this week, the blood, the purchases, the phone, the Uber receipt, exists because Celeste is no longer here to describe any of it herself. The messages that prosecutors read into the record this week are, in a strange and painful way, the closest thing to her own testimony that this case will ever have. They're not just proof of what happened to her. They're one of the last places her voice still exists in her own words, unfiltered, exactly as she wrote it. A 13-year-old telling someone what she wanted for her own life, months before anyone made sure she wouldn't get it. This video is based on court testimony, filings, and reporting from an ongoing criminal case. Everything described here is an allegation unless a verdict says otherwise. And David Burke is presumed innocent unless and until he is proven guilty in a court of law. Nothing here should be read as a final account of what happened. A preliminary hearing tests whether a case can proceed, not whether it's true. And the facts as understood today may shift as the hearing continues, as a trial date is set, and as both sides present their full case to a jury. We'll follow this one as it moves forward. If any part of this story affected you personally, especially anyone who has experienced abuse or knows someone who has, support is available through local and national organizations built for exactly that. You don't have to search far to find one, and you don't have to go through it alone. If you want to stay caught up as this hearing continues, and as whatever comes next in this case unfolds, consider subscribing. It costs nothing, it takes a second, and it helps more than you'd think.